Life in the Trinity Ministry, in partnership with Brian McLaren, is pleased to present this series entitled The Storyline of the Bible.
Many of you know that I was a pastor for 24 years, and 9 or 10 months ago, I finished my work as a pastor, and we brought a new pastor into the church, and I've been traveling a lot since then, but our hope has been that I could simply become a member of the church. I want to help however I can, preach when I'm asked to, but otherwise just be of service however I can. And I'm very happy to say that that process has been working beautifully, and our new pastor is doing just a fantastic job. And now I get the pleasure and privilege of being a regular member of the church, just attending, sitting down like everybody else, and just being part of the congregation. And I'm very grateful to our congregation because they have just made that possible for me. They don't treat me like anybody special, or I'm just another member of the church, and that's been a great thing. So yesterday was one of those Sundays I didn't have to preach anywhere else, and I didn't preach at Cedar Ridge, my home church. I just got to go and sit there and be part of the service and participate in communion and sing and pray and especially to listen to the sermon. And it really struck me yesterday as I was sitting in church how much I love the Bible. I've been studying it for most of my life, and it just never loses fascination for me. I just couldn't stop taking notes during the sermon yesterday, just noticing things in texts that I've read and even preached before. But there's just always so much more there. And I want to indulge one more time in looking at the book of Genesis before we move on in our overview of the biblical story. We're going from across the whole scope of the biblical narrative. We're looking at it in 7 episodes, and we've talked about creation, crisis, and calling as the first 3 episodes, and all of them are rooted in the book of Genesis. But what I'd like to do in this podcast is give you a kind of a strange way of looking at the book of Genesis. And this might be disturbing to some people, and I'm not proposing it as high doctrine. It's just something I've noticed, and some other people have drawn my attention to. And this way of looking at Genesis sees, among other things, Genesis a grappling with the problem of what do we do about the evil that's in the world. The sense that we have in the beginning of Genesis that the world is good, it's very good, it's created by God, and yet human beings have brought so much evil. What should people do about evil in the world? And this way of looking at the book of Genesis sees a series of attempts at dealing with evil, a kind of an evolution, what one author calls a genesis of justice in the Bible. Maybe you've never looked at the book of Genesis in this way, as describing the emergence of a mature understanding of justice. And again, I'm not saying this is the only way to look at it, but let me just propose this to you, that what we have in the book of Genesis is a series of responses to evil, and each response, in a sense, works and yet doesn't work. And so we have to move to a higher and higher level of response. So let's just give this a try. We're going to start at the beginning of Genesis, where human beings are innocent. Now, maybe you never noticed this before, but there are 2 creation stories, one in chapter 1 and one in chapter 2, and the stories are different. Now, you either can see that as contradiction, or you can see that as different angles in on the same reality. So, in the first story, how do we deal with the problem of evil? We just try to be innocent. And in the first story, it's just pure goodness. There's nothing wrong with the world at all. You even get this in relationship to the idea of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis 1, we aren't even told about such a tree. Take Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. Now, isn't that interesting? In Genesis 1, we don't have God saying, I give you every tree except for one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You can't eat of that. That comes in chapter 2. So in chapter 1, what we have is just this pure innocence with no rules at all. And that's sometimes the way we can try to respond to evil in the world. We can just say, let's just act as if there isn't evil and see what happens. But of course, evil emerges. So that brings us to chapter 2. And in the second creation story, let's listen to the way these trees are described. This is Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. And the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye, good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then go up to verse 16. And the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, in this approach to evil, basically we say, okay, there is one choice you can make that's evil. Everything else is good, but that choice comes with the strictest penalty possible, the death penalty. If you eat of that tree, God says, then you will die. And in fact, it's very specific. When you eat of it, you will die. You will experience immediate death when you eat of this tree. Well, that's another way we can deal with evil. We can say make one rule or very simple rule and have the strictest possible punishment if you break that rule. Of course, what happens? Human beings break the rule. And so is God just going to wipe them out? If that's the case, it will be a very, very short book. This book, the Bible, it will be basically 2 chapters. But God doesn't give them the death penalty. Now, a lot of us grew up hearing people say, well, yes, he did, because death means separation, and they were separated at that point. Well, the text doesn't say anything like that. It gives us this dynamic tension. You will die, but they don't die. Instead, what happens, and this would be a third response to the possibility of evil, instead of dying, they're kicked out of the garden. So in Genesis 3:22, the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. And he drove the man out. He placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword, flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So isn't this interesting? First we have the way to deal with evil is just make everything good, and then evil will go away. Kind of a romantic view, if you will. Then the idea, well, no, the way to deal with evil is threaten people with a death penalty. But then you have the problem, what happens when they do it? Do you really want to wipe them out? Then you have this third possibility, which is exclude them from privilege and heap punishment on them for doing bad. And maybe if you exclude them from privilege and heap punishment on them, maybe then they'll fly right and start to behave. Well, that brings us to the fourth problem, because even though they've been excluded from the garden, they're still doing evil. And we see it in the story of Cain and Abel. Now, what's interesting here is that when you remember the story, Cain, I'll start in chapter 4, verse 2. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now, we talked about this some weeks ago, so I'm not going to go into the details about my understanding of what Cain and Abel represent. But listen to what happens now. Cain is angry. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Maybe we could say this is the counseling response to evil. God gives this very gentle guidance, He asks him questions, he draws him out, he warns him of negative consequences. A very different situation from keeping people innocent or threatening them with the death penalty or excluding them from privilege. Here we have this very gentle kind of counseling guidance. Of course, what happens? Does that work? No, it doesn't work. Cain goes and kills his brother anyway. It doesn't respond to God's gentle guidance and warning. Now, this is really interesting, because now the next thing that happens is Cain complains. God sends him out to and basically says, you're going to have to be a restless wanderer on the earth. You're going to feel alienated from the land, and we have this sort of intensification of human alienation. But look at Genesis 4, verse 13. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I'll be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. But the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now this is just so bizarre, isn't it? Now what we have God doing is actually protecting the criminal. The one who's done the crime is protected from vengeance for murder. What a fascinating dynamic is going on here. It really is quite staggering. So we've gone from a state of innocence to a condition of making a death penalty for the one crime, one penalty, to then excluding from privilege and making people experience negative consequences for their negative actions, to providing gentle guidance and warning, to now actually protecting the criminal from vengeance by other people. And then it gets even more intense and more complex when we go over to Genesis chapter 6, because then we have the story of the flood. We'll start at verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So the key words are corruption and violence. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make an ark of cypress wood, etc., etc. A couple verses down. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark. I bring 2 of every living creature, and so on. Now, do you see what's happening here? How do we deal with the problem of evil and injustice in the world? Let's just destroy everybody except for one person, Noah, who's depicted as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, who walked with God. So here's the idea. How do we solve evil in the world? Get rid of everybody who does bad and only keep the good people. Now, this is a harsh word, but I think we have to feel that what's going on here in Genesis. Here's one option for dealing with evil: genocide. Kill all the bad people. Then the ones who are left will be good people, and hopefully things will go better. But of course, that's not how it happens at all, because as soon as the story of the flood is over and Noah and his sons have come back out of the ark, what happens? Noah gets drunk, and one of his sons does something that's seen as very bad, and you've got a cycle of evil going on again. So this action doesn't work to solve the problem. And in fact, you even feel this in the narrative. First, God repents for creating human beings because of the evil. But then when you get to chapter 9, start at verse 8, God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, with every living creature that was with you, birds, livestock, wild animals, etc. Every living creature on earth, I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this will be a sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I've set my rainbow in the clouds. It will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring the clouds over the earth, the rainbow appears in the clouds. I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. So it's as if as soon as the flood is over, even before Noah and his sons have messed up, God says, well, that's not the best way to deal with this problem. Now, I don't mean to sound disrespectful. I'm not trying to portray God in a bad light. I'm just saying the text presents God as a character involved in the story, and it's as if one response to evil after another is tried and discarded. Now, I don't think that this is to be taken in a way that presents God as not really knowing what's going on, kind of like a absent-minded professor who tries one thing and it doesn't work and tries another. Not at all. I actually think what's going on here is the book of Genesis is depicting our struggle to figure out, as people who believe in God, how we can join God in dealing with evil. And then we get to, after this incident of the flood, we get to another incident, the Tower of Babel, and there is a very different strategy of dealing with evil, almost the opposite of the violence that we just saw in that we might call the genocide against evil people. You get to chapter 11. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, found a plain in Shinar and settled there, they said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. I think the idea here is a new engineering technology is discovered which makes it possible to build multi-story buildings, which makes possible higher densities and concentration of people. Then these people said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Now, what does this suggest? I think it suggests another way of dealing with evil from this ancient primal story. And again, we can't interpret these the way we would interpret a modern newspaper article. We've got to go back into the ancient mind and let the stories work the way ancient stories are supposed to work. And I think the idea here is, well, using a flood to wipe everybody out doesn't work. But when people concentrate in large numbers, their violence and injustice and oppression and evil becomes so great. The solution here is, let's decentralize. Let's scatter people. We might today talk about checks and balances in government. Don't let anybody have absolute power because that will corrupt absolutely. Don't let any one group of people become too powerful. Let's keep people at least sort of playing off against each other. Scatter them. Don't let them all consolidate power. And that's another way of dealing with evil. Interesting progression that we've got. And then it gets even more interesting when we come to chapter 12, because there is God's calling of Abraham. Now remember, Abraham begins a whole new episode in the story. We go creation, crisis, now the calling of Abraham. And God says, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So here the picture is, we've tried all these other ways of dealing with evil and injustice in this world. Just innocence. Keep people innocent, naked in a garden. But that they still do evil. Threaten them with the death penalty. Maybe that'll stop them. But no, that doesn't stop them. Exclude them from privilege and let them reap bad consequences for their behavior. They still do evil. Give them gentle guidance and counseling and warning about evil. That doesn't stop them. Then we see the villain and the criminal be protected. And then we see this idea of just wipe all the bad people out. Then we see this idea, decentralize, use checks and balances, keep people scattered. But now God, through Abraham, says, okay, how are we going to help all the nations who are filled with evil? Well, we're going to pick one family, the family of Abraham. We're going to bless Abraham and let Abraham bring blessing to everyone else. And what to me is so absolutely fascinating about that approach is that that's the approach that carries through the rest of the book of Genesis and, of course, the rest of the Bible. Because Abraham develops a family, and he has a son named Isaac, and he has a son named Jacob, and he has a son named Joseph. And when we get to the end of Genesis, as we saw last time, we have Joseph, who in a way is the one who suffered most from the evil of his brothers. And yet, the way he responds to their evil is by forgiving them and by realizing that God has used even their evil to bring him to a situation where he can do good to them. It's just fascinating. So again, what I'm trying to do, I'm not trying to say that anything disrespectful about the book of Genesis or the characterization of God. I'm trying to let these stories, these ancient stories, work the way ancient stories work. And they show a grappling of and sort of picking up one method of dealing with evil, but it doesn't work. Picking up another. And the method that works, the method that brings us to the end of Genesis with something of a happy ending, is the way to deal with evil in the world is to recruit some people to work with God so that no matter how much evil others bring, we're going to keep responding with forgiveness and reconciliation. We're going to do good to those who've done evil to us. And that is the lasting way of dealing with the problem of evil. Well, I find this just absolutely fascinating. It lets me feel some of the complexity and richness of the Bible. There are many other ways to read the book of Genesis. I'm not saying this is the best one or the only one. But as we think of the biblical story and the complexity and richness of the Bible, I hope this little guided tour of just the issue of justice and response to justice in the book of Genesis will fill you, as it does me, with some sense of admiration and awe. And I hope it will help you as it helps me to picture my own life and picture the evil and injustice I have to deal with and to figure, and learning from these stories, how do I respond? Do I just sort of play innocent as if we're still in the garden? Do I make threats that if people do something bad to me, I'll do something bad? Do I just say, well, you're going to get bad consequences from the evil you do? Do I think that just giving them gentle guidance will be all that is necessary? Do I respond by wanting to wipe everybody out, just get them out of town if they're a problem to me? Or do I accept this very beautiful strategy that we see in the calling of Abraham? Well, in our next podcast, we'll carry the story on. We'll look at, as we move from creation to crisis to calling, we'll look at the conversation. And this will take us into the bulk of the Old Testament story. Until then, this is Brian McLaren with Wired Parish.
You've been listening to WiredParish.com. Visit us online for exclusive podcasts with some of the most challenging writers, thinkers, and speakers in the church. We bring you coffeehouse conversations with the best and the brightest. Tune in, turn on, get wired. WiredParish.com.